Okay, so welcome to this business analysis training, data privacy training. And we'll be looking at how you can become a data privacy analyst or data protection analyst, or sometimes a GDPR um, uh, business analyst. So sometimes you see some jobs that actually will say they're looking for. In fact, one of the ladies that was on the program, I think her first contract was a GDPR BA. And when I started out, funny enough, because of my business analysis background, the job title then was GDPR business analyst until the role just evolved and it grew into what it became eventually. So the steps to take, as mentioned, you acquire the knowledge of the general data protection regulation, you get some certifications. That's not to say that you can't get a job without these professional certifications, because using the example of the ladies as well, they hadn't. I think now Faith is working towards one of the qualifications board certifications, but at the time she didn't have it. But it's advisable that you get one of these certifications provided by the International Association of Privacy Professionals, get your hands-on experience, and then, of course, look at transferable skills, soft skills, that, of course, will help you to do the job properly. So today we'll be looking at key definitions from the GDPR, some principles, and hopefully, time permitting, we will look at responsibilities of a privacy analyst. At the end of this session, hopefully, you should have gotten some understanding or definition of core terms of the GDPR. Now we've picked out some of these terms because there's a lot. It's quite text heavy, as you would imagine. It's a regulatory compliance related subject, and so there's a lot to read. 99 individual articles and different things to also get out of it, but not all of those articles are you shouldn't be bogged down sort of trying to memorize, oh, what does article 1 or 2, 3 say? At the end of the day, what you want to aim for is, how do you interpret, how are you able to help an organization to translate this, what the requirements of these articles or actually means for the business with regards to compliance. And so we will pick a few of those and try to unpack those definitions. And what is personal information? Because not all data, not all information is under the scope of the GDPR. So we will look at the ones that are, because you also need to be very familiar with that, so that when you're working on the job, and you will definitely have those questions. Oh, how can you define, can you let us know which of what is personal information, which the categories of personal information that are sensitive, and the ones that are in scope of a GDPR, the ones that are out of scope. So you will get those sort of questions when you're working within an organization, and so you will help them to do what you call data classification and all of those. So we're not going to go into that technical bit now, but you need to get an understanding of what type of personal information is subject to the GDPR. And data subjects are individuals that, of course, the GDPR is protecting. So yourself, myself, and customers, people that, of course, we work with, whose data we process for whatever intent or purpose. And then we'll look at the scope of the GDPR, whether geographic or organizational. And the big one is, data subject rights. At the end of the day, the actual foundation behind this whole regulation, as it were, is really, or legislation, is really to protect the data that belongs to individuals, so that we have more rights over our own personal information. And so that is why. And so that is why, we've got those rights, and we will talk about that as well. And of course, people who fall foul, so organizations, data controllers who fall foul will, of course, be penalized, and then those are the fines. We'll look at that quickly. A controller, which I mentioned earlier, can be an individual, can be a man, just one person who is processing personal data for whatever purpose. And now the controller is a person that determines that reason, the purpose of collecting that data, of obtaining that data, and using the data for whatever means, as it were. So you are the controller. You determine, okay, this is what I'm going to use it for. So that's purpose. And the next one is the means. How are you going to process it? Is it via some systems? Is it handing out paper? And there's different ways of looking at it. So whoever determines the purpose and the means of the processing of personal data is referred to as the data controller. And on the other hand, the processor is the one that processes on behalf of, so sometimes let's use the example of, let's say you go online and you go on to Next and you want to get, you want to order something from Next. Okay, distraction there. That's my daughter. Okay, anyway, so yeah, and so let's use the example of you going on to the Next website and you wanted to place an order for something. Next, of course, that's their site. They've got a database where all that information is going on to. But then if you want that item delivered, they would probably, of course, maybe if they don't have, let's say they want to use Royal Mail, DPD, or any of these delivery services or companies, those guys, of course, will be the processors in the sense that Next will pass your information to this delivery company to say, can you deliver to number 118, blah, 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 and all of that. So they will now be processing the information on behalf of Next. So you can have third-party processors, of course, they are just not, so, but what the way it is that even though Next is the controller, they've got to, if they decide to have, of course, they would have a list of preferred suppliers, as it were. So they would say, okay, we only use Royal Mail, DPD, and all of that. They would have vetted them, well, technically. They check that, okay, these guys also are taking, your data as seriously, the security of your data as seriously as they would, ensuring that, the way your data is stored in their database is secure and all of that. And there's a lot that goes into it. And most times the relationship between the controller and processor is really contractual. So there should be a written document that states that, okay, you are part of our preferred suppliers, so you are one of our processors, and we expect that the data that we pass to you should be used only for X, Y, and Z. And we also probably will say that sometimes we might audit your systems to check and all of those things. According to the GDPR, you've got to make sure that it is written so that those data protection provisions are clearly stated within that document, which is then exchanged between the controller and processor. And that's kind of where that comes in. And then there are different, as you go on, you see, you find out more about relationship between, data controller and processors, or sometimes you might have two data controllers, sort of processing the same information. And there's different, I don't want to go into that now, but just get that understanding. The data controller determines the purpose and the means. Oh, wow, she's here now. Determines the purpose and the means of the processing of personal data, while the processor is the one that processes on behalf of the controller. Now, consent, I think we already mentioned, but most of us know what it means. And according to the GDPR, consent must be freely given. It must be specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes. So, for instance, you can't you can't cajole, you can't force, you can't enforce certain, or rather maybe just say that, okay, you give me your consent. If you don't give me your consent, or if you don't say yes, let me use the word yes, I don't want to use consent as a word. If you don't approve of me collecting your information, I will not provide one service or the other. So it needs to be really clear. And then also when you are requesting for consent from data subjects, from individuals, you need to really be very clear as to why you need that information. So there's no, back in the days, you'll see, you know, tiny prints, terms and conditions, where a lot of us would never read. Back in the days, it was okay for us to, for organizations to hide, you know, little, they say that that's where they're getting consent, but they know that most times you will not read it. And so chances are that you will not even have, you know, ticked any box or whatever. So according to GDPR, they're no longer allowed to hide, you know, that request for consent within T's and C's. And if you must put it out, it needs to be very clear and specific, you know, so that you know that you are giving it freely as an individual, as against someone being, someone tricking you, you know, in giving your approval for whatever intent or purpose. Okay, so now we talked about the scope of the GDPR. Where does it, because scope just means there would be boundaries, as it were, constraints. So does it apply to everybody? Does it apply across the globe, you know, to every individual? The answer is no. So let's look at that now. Now, the regulation applies to controllers and processors, which you already saw earlier, in the EU, that's the European Union, irrespective of where processing takes place. Let me explain that. Now, the example of, let me still go back to that website as an example. So for instance, now the data, of course, now the GDPR is protecting EU individuals, so people that are, of course, EU citizens, as it were, or people who live within the EU. So that is, you know, so if you're not out, if you're outside of the EU, I would say you're out of scope. Let's put it that way. So it's just individuals within the EU. Okay. Now let's say, for instance, I'm a business. And I am, let's say I'm outside the EU, okay? But I am processing information that belongs to people within the UK, or no, the UK is of course Brexit now, that's a different question altogether. But let's say France, Germany, any of the EU countries or member states, as they're referred to. So let's say, okay, so I am in any of these countries, right? Or sorry, outside any of these countries, but I have a website, okay, that is global, that has a global reach, meaning people within the EU, individuals within the EU have access to that site. Okay, that means there is a chance, a fair chance, that you will be capturing information that belongs to people within the EU. And so that may, you have to think about GDPR. Now, I'm emphasizing that because when I was my very first contract, they kept saying, because we I think we're across 60 countries now, then. And of course, they were saying, especially the US. So, you know, US, they like to just, you know, they don't like laws, let me put it that way. And so it was more a case of, so our businesses within the US were saying, oh, well, does GDPR apply to us? We're not in the EU. Why do we have to do all of that? And da, da, da. And so the way we managed that, we had to say, okay, for those of you who have local sites, so sites that would only be, you know, processed or maybe chances of what you call people outside the US accessing the site is zilch, almost nothing's negligible, then you can say that you're outside. But of course, if your site is a global, and then you, of course, ways you can technically, I mean, there's ways of how you can actually restrict access to a site, you know, to certain geographies, as it were. So all that is something that can be done technically, okay? But if your site is accessible globally, then you've got to be GDPR compliant. You've got to think about it, because 9 times out of 10, you will get somebody from the EU accessing that site. And that's why companies like Facebook, Amazon, and all these big organizations that people go on from everywhere had to think about GDPR. So they couldn't just say, oh, no, we're not in the EU. No, but they are operating, and their sites are, of course, accessible across the globe. So chances are that they will be processing data that belongs to people within the EU. So that's what that means, irrespective of where that processing takes place. If the data that you're capturing belongs to EU individuals, you got to think about data protection and security. So just a recital there, it says the protection afforded by the regulation should apply to natural persons. And so you can't say, oh, that my dead relative, I'm going to complain because somebody processed some information that was in their system some 10 years or whatever ago. You can't do that. So it only applies to living individuals, natural persons. So whatever their nationality or place of residence, okay, so I already mentioned that. Now it applies to personal activities that are related to goods or services, irrespective of whether payment is required. So you can't say, oh, I'm a charity, my site, really, there's no transaction going there. So I don't really need to worry, and all of those things. But if you are capturing information, if you are just providing content, and there is like a form and people are filling that information, people within the EU, so you've got to think about GDPR as well. Okay, and or if you are monitoring the behavior, so we have all these tracking tools and tracking technologies that organizations place on sites. When you go on, they say cookies, about all of that. If you are dropping that and these sites are accessible to EU individuals, you've got to think about data protection and security. So just listen. I'm just going to pick, there are a few articles which are relevant because I said there are over 99 individual articles and we can't go through them, but I've just picked a few that you need to be mindful of. One, so Article 7, and don't worry about trying to say, oh God, am I going to memorize and remember? Don't worry too much, because a lot of these things, they're there, you can get the information. Now, as a data subject, you've got a right to lodge a complaint. Back in the days, you had to be some big person and all of that, but the GDPR gives you the right to lodge a complaint even against Sterling Careers, to say, okay, maybe you asked us about information that we hold up, or you asked us to delete your information. Maybe you've completed the course and you're like, I don't want you to store my information for anything else. I'm done with you, and all of that. And if we say no, for instance, for whatever reason, of course, we've got to have a lawful basis for holding that information. I'm not going to go into that now. Or if you go on our website or any organization's website and you find that, okay, there isn't a cookie banner, there is no way of managing cookie preference, and a cookie has been dropped on your machine without obtaining your consent or anything, it could be, you as an individual have a right to lodge a complaint to the supervisory authority of that within that local jurisdiction. So GDPR allows you to do that. You can lodge a complaint. Okay, or even lodge a complaint to if your employee, for instance. So these days, organizations have different ways of monitoring employee or staff performance, performance, okay, but maybe behavior, profiling, and there's a lot of all those sensitive processing activities that the GDPR frowns at. So if as an employee, you find out that, oh, they've introduced some new tracking technology, which maybe they didn't even tell you guys about, and you find it a bit intrusive and you're not comfortable, you are well within your right to file a complaint to the supervisory authority, and the list goes on. So that's about Article 77. Now, Article 78 talks about the right to an effective judicial remedy against the supervisor. So now it just means, okay, it's still around your right, and you can actually even though the supervisory authority is, of course, the higher, is it Lord and Master in this instance, and if, for instance, a decision was made, let's say you filed a complaint and you're not happy with the decision, you could actually you could question, you could, what's the word I'm trying to find? You could challenge, okay, against their decision if you feel like, okay, no, it wasn't fair and things like that. So from all of this, it just means that the data subject has a lot of control now, of their data, of how their data is being processed and how their privacy, is being managed, especially with regards to or by data controllers and data processors as well. So if, for instance, a complaint has been brought to court and you did not, you felt that it wasn't fairly treated, you can actually you can challenge and all of that. That's just what it talks about. So as an individual, you may not even, so I think a lot of times it's organizations, maybe when something happens, maybe a data subject files a complaint and they're sort of trying to, because they would want to argue their case and things like that. But a lot of times the data subject's rights would, of course, be considered, put into considerations above any other thing that the business is trying to argue and things like that, even if brought before the court of law within that member state. Of course, right to compensation and liability, that's a good one. So if you have suffered material or non-material damage as a result of your data being processed by a controller or a data processor, okay, you can sue, you can file for, damage, caused by the processing. So you could just say, well, the way my data was processed, I felt still around it being intrusive, and it has, some people might say it has cost me mental health issues, and there's just a lot that you could, but let me just say that these things are there, but it's very, very rare that people really even remember and things like that. But it's just one to know about. And so let's look at the conditions for imposing administrative fines. So we talked about the fact that if you fall foul as a data controller, as an organization, of course, chances are that you will be met with a fine, you will be penalized. So now the GDPR has ways of determining, the fine that is imposed on you. Let me give you an example. So for instance, we had at work, I think a few years ago, where a staff took out a flash drive that had thousands of records, just because the person wanted to work. You know how you will take your laptop home, work from home and things like that. And somehow, unfortunately, it got stolen or lost. And of course, this was now reported to my team. And we had to, of course, carry out some investigation. But what then happened was that even though we weren't fined, the normal, everybody talks about, the 2% of your annual global annual turnover, as the main thing that people talk about, but it is not, that's not how it is. Face value, yes, it is, but what the supervisory authority would do, they would look at, the situation, the circumstance, and they will weigh a few things, which will then help them to determine the measure of penalty that you will get. Okay, so using that example, we weren't fined. They didn't say, oh yes, you're going to pay 10 million euros or whatever. It was more a case of, okay, let's look at what the condition, why was this staff trained, what do you have in place in terms of security? Do you have a way of turning off maybe? Is there a system that would, how, for instance, most big organizations have a way of disabling, maybe like your system remotely without you being there. So for us, if something happened, we just go straight quickly and we can disable that system, for instance, as an example, remotely, whilst we're going through that investigation. So they would ask you, so do you have those measures in place for managing such scenarios and things like that. Now, not all organizations may be able to afford that because it is quite, most of those things are quite expensive, as it were. And so if you don't even have that, what do you have in place? So the supervisory authority would ask you, or the auditors will ask you, what have you done, and all of those things. And based on what you have in place, they will now say, okay, this is a fine, that will be given to you. For us, that example, yes, we said I had to write a report saying that, yes, we have trained our staff, and that particular drive has a dedicated cabinet, which is securely stored away. And really and truly, these staff at this time did not adhere to what we had in place. And also they'll look at all of those things during that investigation. And so we were able to get away with a slap on the wrist, let me use that way. So no monetary fine, but it was more a case of we had to commit to putting certain things in place at a particular time. So technically, that's how this would work. So they will look at the nature, the gravity, the duration of the infringement. Was it sometimes they will say, were we negligent? In the sense, even though internally we actually, that staff had to go. Yeah. So we would say, yes, you went against what we had, our policy and procedure in place. You were negligent. So internally, our internal investigation, we came to that. But of course, we will cover ourselves as an organization to say, well, we train the staff, we put this in place, and we put it all in writing. We are able to demonstrate. We send them, things that we've got, and they can review it, and then they can decide on what the next line of action will be. Okay, so these are the things that they would consider to say, okay, was it just outright negligence, or just, carelessness as an organization of you guys don't care about, the data security and things like that. And so if you don't have those measures in place, chances of getting a higher penalty or admin fine, of course, will be higher as against not. Okay, so these are general conditions for imposing administrative fines. Now, the degree of responsibility of a controller processor taking into, we already talked about the technical organizational measures implemented by them. Okay, so they would always ask you. So I spent weeks having to put together like a report to say, we've got this, we've got that, and this is the evidence and all of that. And then we put and we send it to the people who are, of course, carrying out the investigation and all of that. Okay, and of course, the degree of cooperation. So sometimes some organizations would just, be very difficult to deal with, and they might just refuse to cooperate, and things like that. And sometimes the supervisory authority is actually in their own right to say, right, okay, because you have not provided enough information that we've asked, well, you're fine, so go and deal with it. And things like that. So a lot of times, if you sit down and say, okay, well, this was not intentional, we have this in place. Sometimes these things, you can't avoid them. They will happen regardless of the measures that you've put in place. Okay, now let's talk about this almighty fine that really gets a lot of businesses sitting up on the edge of their seats. 10 million euros, or 2% of your global annual turnover, whichever is higher. Okay, and we'll go in the next slide. You look at specific areas. So it's not everything. So it's not the entire. I mentioned earlier that the GDPR has 99 articles, and so it's not that you don't get this fine for every single every single article that you're in breach of, that you fall foul of. So there are some very sensitive ones that will cause you to get these fines, and we'll look at that in a minute. So some may just be, very low risk. So the GDPR, really, a lot of it's really around risk analysis. So you have low, medium risk, level risk, sorry. So it's really taking a risk-based approach a lot of times. And so it's not every single condition within the GDPR that will be met with this huge fine. So let's look at a few of the ones that will, of course, have a higher chance of attracting such penalties. Consent is such a big one. And so if somebody sort of files a complaint around this whole consent, that you are, of course, you did not, as an organization, as a data controller, you did not adhere to how the GDPR has clearly stated or spelled, how consent should be obtained and what it really means in light of the GDPR. So if you fall foul, and of course they would have carried out their investigation, and if you are, of course, guilty, then chances of you getting that high admin fine is quite high. So that is one. And then processing not requiring identification, anything that has to do with biometrics, your ID, is sensitive information. And so if that situation or that complaint or that scenario is around that, then it falls within that scope. Data protection by design and default, we will talk about that. So that's quite a broad area. So a lot of times, during that investigation, let's say you are maybe a software house, or you've got some technical product or IT products, and you have not factored in that data protection. Right, sorry about that. So those they fall within. Okay, they're on a break, sorry. So that would, of course, fall within that scope as well. So joint controllers, I talked about two organizations or two bodies sort of having. Remember that what is the definition of a controller is someone that has determines the purpose, okay, and the means of that data. So sometimes you could have two organizations as joint controllers, and a lot of times there's a lot of blurred lines if your contracts are not properly done and it's not clearly stated liabilities, who is responsible for what, and if there is a breach, or if someone, maybe one of these companies sort of falls foul, there's always that, okay, who bears what percentage of risk versus not. So those kind of areas are always very, very tricky, and they may, of course, they do fall within that scope. Data processing, that's just how you obtain, how you store, how you use. So processing is not only when you're using the data, even obtaining the data is referred to as processing. Storing the data in a database, in an Excel, anywhere, is still processing. So you don't say, oh, we just store it, we don't use it for anything. You are processing the data. And all of those come within the scope. Data security, of course, if there is a data security incident that is like on top, it is so according to Article 32, some of these articles you can read further, so that would help your knowledge and understanding of these areas. Notification of breaches to supervisory authority. So there is, you will learn that as well, when, for instance, there is an incident, a data breach incident, for example, according to GDPR, you are expected to report that incident from the time that you become aware. You've got 72 hours to, okay, you have got 72 hours to report this breach incident to the supervisory authority. Now, I must caveat that and say that not all breach incidents are reportable, that should be reported. So you've got to, as a consultant, as a data privacy analyst, you will help the organization to carry out that risk assessment, do some further investigation, and the ICO, there's a lot of material that would help you to actually go through that checklist. I would normally have an Excel and I ask certain questions, then that would help you determine whether that incident should be reported or not. Because I was in a conference with the ICO some years back, and a lot of questions, people were asking questions, and they said one thing that they get is too many reports being sent to them without first going through the checklist that they've provided that would help you to determine whether that incident is one that should be reported or one that can be dealt with internally. So for us, we had a few incidents here and there, but I don't remember. I think there was only one, which was eventually even kind of sort of resolved. So a lot of it, we just carry out our investigation internally, and then there's a way that we can determine whether we need to report it or not. So if, for instance, you are expected to, after you have carried out that analysis, and it falls within the remit or the scope of breaches or incidents that must be reported, and you do not, and you are eventually found out, that is one that would also attract that penalty. That's such a big one, because all the big organizations, they just sort of put it on that wraps. They won't, and they just look for some ways to explain it. Some get away with it, but if you're found out, you'll be penalized or penalized. Communication of breaches to data subjects, that's another one. So a lot of times, like for us, oh gosh, for us, we would, I think there were some incidents where we did investigation, and then we were able to determine the fact that we didn't, we were not expected to report it to the ICO. However, we had to notify all affected data subjects, all affected individuals whose data was, of course, impacted by this incident. So that's something. So I'm sure you will see, sometimes you would have seen some emails come to you to say, oh, there was a data breach incident. We have contained it internally, but we are just notifying you that it was, it happened, but it's now being managed and all of those things. And so you're communicating. But if you are supposed to and you do not, then that could fall within that scope. A data protection impacts assessment. A lot of times when you're under investigation, they would always ask you, so, okay, this system that was probably affected, was a DPIA done? A DPIA is just a data protection impacts assessment, which is something you will learn when you're working on projects here. Prior consultation with your data subjects, that's another expectation. So if you are introducing a new technology that could process, or that could that you would normally that is expected to process information, in an intrusive manner, the expectation is that you consult with data subjects so they know that this is coming. But a lot of times, most big organizations don't even do that. But if you're found out, that comes within scope. I'm going to move quickly. And also, okay, so you can read around that. So there are some categories and a few of these areas that are in scope. And of course, if you fall foul, if you are non-compliant, you stand a chance of that penalty. And that's kind of those bits that I've just run through now, which goes to tell you that it's not everything that is that would attract that penalty or fine. So I put this here just in case you're wondering, why the heck do I need all of these articles and policies and and all of that information? You need it because as a privacy analyst or privacy officer, these are your responsibilities. So those bits that we covered, you need to be familiar, because you will be supporting businesses, you will be supporting teams, and therefore, when those questions come, you know where to go and what the actual article says or the requirement is. So as a privacy analyst, you are looking at policies, procedures, you're helping with, having that governance in place when it comes to data protection and privacy. So privacy-related training and awareness is also within the remit of the privacy analyst. And so, like for us, my team, we were, responsible for ensuring that annual GDPR training was, of course, launched every year across all our employees across all geographies. So that was my team. We will put the content together, administer, and all of those things. So as privacy analyst, you will be expected to kind of spearhead that. And also design and implementation of privacy controls. So you will be sort of helping and supporting to help organizations to implement those privacy controls and even design so how it should be, because you have to think about the business and how it really apply and how it would work within that organization. So the design comes in and how you're supporting the implementation. So for me, I was sitting within the tech department. So a lot of projects, new things that we're doing will come on my desk and I will look at it. They send me forms and different solutions that they're looking to explore. Even our marketing teams, I would say, right, okay, maybe move this there, make sure there's a tick box here, and all of those things. And so you, as a privacy analyst, you support your organization to perform privacy impact assessment, privacy by design in product management. So if you are sitting within the product team, as a privacy analyst, you will be the one looking at, okay, product design that you're looking at. Have you thought about the privacy considerations? Have you thought about data protection? This product that you want to launch, this application, this software, have you thought privacy firsthand? So it says, think about it, first. Think privacy first as against it being an afterthought, which was what a lot of organizations were doing. So the privacy analyst also would look at carrying out audits. So this is part of the governance element. So we, for instance, we would do like annual, I think it became twice a year, just those audits, just around ensuring that we are remaining compliant with regards to how we handle personal data across our data ecosystem. So you as privacy analyst, that's on you supporting the business. And also you help to prepare for regulatory change like the GDPR. And also this one is a big one, vendor management. Now you'll see that a good percentage of data breach incidents from reports that we've seen have been, from third-party vendors, as it were, or third-party softwares or applications that we integrate with. So you as an organization, you might have your infrastructure and your systems well secured and have all the right controls in place, but then your vendor that you do stuff with may not be their security posture may not be as solid as yours, but it is your responsibility as an organization to audit, to check, that the people that you actually even do business, that you sign up with, are thinking they're GDPR compliant. So for me, then I would say we have like an onboarding of vendors. So we have a step, we have like a checklist. We will ask them, are they GDPR compliant? Yes. What's your SOC report? What security measures you have in place? And all of those things. And if they are not meeting a good percentage that we feel is comfortable, we will not sign up with them. Okay, so you as a privacy analyst, that's you will help your organization. Vendor risk management is so important. Sometimes you can get a contract and all they're asking you to do is to support that, to help them implement a mechanism for managing their vendors. And there's different ways. Thankfully, now there's different softwares. Thank God for OneTrust that would help, to make it a lot easier than if you had to do it manually. And also, you support helping them to ensure that they're for cross-border transfer. So that just means data that is going outside of the EU borders, as it were. You have to do business anyway, so you can't restrict your business only within the EU. So you want, of course, a global reach, and that means you will probably be sharing data with organizations outside of the EU borders. So that is allowed. However, you must ensure that you have the right mechanisms in place, i.e. contracts, where a lot of it, it might just be, okay, a data process, what you call a data processing agreement, which will be written by both parties or agreed by both parties and signed. And if anything was to go wrong, so all your indemnity, liability, who's responsible for what, all of that will be in there. And during the course of this course, you will see a typical template, and you are not expected, you're not a lawyer. So as a privacy analyst, you're not expected to sit down and write these things because you don't have that expertise. And that's why privacy analysts tend to work with legal. If you're lucky, I didn't have legal. Well, we had to outsource, so we don't have a legal arm. So we had a legal what do you call them, consultant that were on our retainers. So it was more a case of each time I needed legal counsel, I will consult with them. And so they would look at ensuring that those contracts are watertight, because if anything was to go wrong and you had those contracts, that's the first thing that they will ask you in a court of law. So that's pretty much what is on your table as a privacy analyst. So I want to stop and take a break. Maybe just grab a cup of water. I know a lot has been going on, and you're like, oh, that's a lot to take in. Yes, for now it is, but it will get better when you now start, sort of putting that to practice. So I will pause the recording. Grab a cup of water. So let's just, I know we really lost time. I hope everyone's still good. Let's take a 10 minutes break and come back at 10:27. If that's okay, can you type in the chat a yes or a thumbs up? So we aim to come back at 12:27. Let me know if that's okay. Type it in the chat. Thank you. Okay, I hope I still have everyone here. I still have Cholu Olaleko. Is that okay? We'll come back in 10 minutes. Ifoma, we'll catch up later. I'm not sure what happened. We waited for you for 20 minutes, but and it's recorded, so you can catch up. So we'll come back at 10:27. If you're fine, please put it in the chat. I want to see everybody engaging, please. Thank you. Everyone back? If you're back, say type yes in the chat, please, once you're back. Okay, welcome back. I was just trying to reach out to Ifoma. She's not answering. She'll carry on. Okay.
I don't think Veronica is with us now.
I have been talking to myself.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't realize I did not unmute. And that's why the screen was moving. Oh dear, okay. Right, okay, so oh dear. Okay, so personal data is what you see here. And I was given some examples. Some of you might ask, why do you have IP address? Because an IP address is linked to your individual home, your router, as it were. So it is personal information. But you can look at that later as well. I've been talking to myself all along. Okay, quickly, let's look at the core principles of the GDPR, which you as a privacy analyst need to have at your fingertips, on your fingertips, so that you can support an organization. And when they ask you, okay, one, lawful basis for processing. That is, why do you need this information? In line with the GDPR. And we will look at some of those lawful bases. For us, SCL, we collect your data, your name, email address. We hardly do phone numbers, but name, email address. And it is really contractual because you have expressed interest in joining the course. And so in order for us to deliver this service, i.e., which includes, sending you meeting invites to join the training, accessing the platforms and all of that, you need your email. And so we sit down and say, we need the information for all of these processing activities. And then we need to sit down and say, this is the lawful reason or lawful basis that we are relying on to ensure we are being GDPR compliant. So you cannot, take us to court and say, why do they need my email address? Why do they need my details? If you have expressed interest in a service from us, we will say, in order for us to fulfill this service, we need this information. And, a lot of organizations can carry out this exercise, and then they will have it documented, all the basic lawful basis of proof. First of all, they will start with all the processing activities. Processing activities just means what you do with the information, with the personal data. So you sit down with marketing and say, okay, marketing, let's have a list of all the ways and all the purposes or reasons that you collect personal information. You write it down. They say to send promotional materials, one, a lot of it is that campaign, Facebook ads, all those things. So they write it down. Then you as a privacy analyst will now say to them, okay, according to GDPR, we now need to determine what is the lawful basis for each of these processing activities so that we are remaining compliant. So for us, it is contractual because you have expressed an interest in a service, and in order for us to fill that service, we will request your information. So lawfulness is just doing it fairly and according to the law, of course, the GDPR. And of course, being fair and transparent. Gone are those days where you hide things in tiny prints. GDPR actually mandates that you see when you go onto a lot of company websites, you will see the privacy policy. It is being fair, transparent, because within the privacy policy, you should state the purposes that the reason why you collect personal information, what you use it for, maybe your data retention and all of those things, so that anybody who gets on your website can for a fact see that you are transparent, you're not hiding anything, and that is a requirement. Or maybe like a cookie banner. So you see these days a lot of, when you land on websites, you see it pop up and it says this site uses cookies for this and that and that, and that is fairness and transparency in line with the principles of GDPR. Purpose limitation. Don't collect data only if it is absolutely needed. Collect only what is required for the purpose of that service or that thing that you want to do. Gone are those days where we collect data and we store it in case we need it. storage limitation, minimize, because you're reducing, I said earlier, you're reducing your risk as a company if you only you don't store data just like for 10, 12 years in case you need it. One is even taking up your storage space, but then also it is of course going to I would say it will increase the risk if anything was to happen to that database or where it is that you store that information. So you want to minimize that as well. And then integrity and confidentiality, always make sure that the data that you are storing is up to date. So because that's data integrity, you don't store, because what we find before GDPR, we had to do like a cleanse, an overhaul of a lot of systems, because some of our databases and some systems had records that go way back, decades, and some people have died, and all of those information is just there. And of course, that is against the law of integrity as well. And then, of course, as a data controller or even a processor, you're accountable, for whatever happens to that data that you are processing, if of course you are in breach or you're not. Sorry about that slide. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about data minimization. So this just sort of breaks it down. I think there's some of you who attended the taster session. I think I covered a few of this. So it's still around that lawful process, a lawful basis. So you need to know for each processing activity that you as an organization carry out, it needs to be clearly documented within your data record, your record of processing activity. There's something you call ROPA. So it is according to Article 30, it says that all data processors and controllers, controllers and processors should have a record of processing activities. We have a record, even though we need to update it as part of the GDPR project. We have a record. You should have a record of all the processing activities that, of course, involves personal data. And vis-a-vis, you need to now say, okay, for each processing activity, this is a lawful basis. For, let's use the example of for delivering training as a service for us, the lawful basis is contractual, because you have expressed interest, you have signed up, and in order for us to deliver that service, we have entered into that contract that we will need this information to do that. Okay, so you must use personal data of individuals in a way that is fair and not detrimental, not intrusive. Think privacy all the time as an organization. We've talked about consent, we've said, so these are so when you as a privacy consultant and you're talking about, oh guys, let's make sure that we are considering the lawful basis. And they say, okay, tell us about this lawful basis. There you go. One, consent. Consent usually should be the last resort, as in you need to look at other lawful bases. A lot of it, legitimate interest. And what is that? If the processing is necessary for the interest of both parties, i.e. the business and that individual or third party. Okay, so both of us, now you've got an interest, you want to become, Tolu said you want to get a success story. So you're interested in changing career and hence you've come onto a course. And then, of course, you will, we will need, and us on the other hand, will need your information in order for us to deliver that. So there is that balance there. You have an interest, we have an interest. One, deliver the service, but then of course there is also, because we're a business at the end of the day, there is a financial motivation as well. But the GDPR says you need to carry out what you call what is just, everybody calls it an LIA. So your legitimate interest assessment, you need to balance it. And you always need to think about the data subject's right above any business interest. It is always like that. So there is a way of carrying that. I think I've got templates I can share with you later, so that would help you to determine if this really falls within legitimate interest, because a lot of organizations will just quickly go for that without carrying out that LIA. Sometimes it may not even be true, but they may put it in their privacy policy to say, for this processing, we rely on legitimate interest. But GDPR says, make sure that you are balancing it well enough, that the benefits that you as a data subject is going to get far, outweighs any potential risk that it could pose on you. So it's more it's the data subject that comes first, and not so much what interest the business may have, for processing that information. Contract already mentioned, two parties coming into a contract and agreeing, that, okay, for us to do this, we need this, and therefore you will have to provide that information. Vital interest. Is it necessary to protect someone's life? That information probably, most time might be health records, which of course is sensitive, but then there is that consideration to be made. I think my slide is going backwards in a funny way. Public interest, public task, I think already mentioned. Legal obligation, so that is also another one to look at. People who are at the, let's say, passport office, border and control, or there's several ways, maybe let me use it, or even employee law that says, before I give you a job as an organization, I'm well within my right to ask for your proof of ID, your proof of residency, and all of that. So you can't say, no, my biometric information is sensitive, I'm not giving it to you. No, but the law says that you need to have that and things like that. And so you can't argue against that. I think we already talked about purpose limitation. Only collect data that is absolutely necessary. Don't collect it and say, okay, we'll keep it in case we use it. There is also repurposing scenarios. So for instance, this is what I find whilst working looking after my brands. And sometimes we collect certain data sets or certain information for one thing. And then we now end up, you find organizations saying, okay, they've got this marketing database, and it's usually marketing teams. They are the most problematic ones to deal with as a privacy consultant, because marketers, well, now I do marketing, so I can relate to some of these things, because at the end of the day, you want to reach out to customers, to leads, to prospects, so that they can sign up, so that they can do business with you. And so you're looking for different ways to do that. So a lot of times you find that you go on websites and they say, fill this form if you want to sign up for our newsletter. And we've got this marketing database that is huge. Then sometimes we now decide that, we want to build, maybe in our own case, I think they were building, we wanted to do some profiling, personalization project. Okay, and so we wanted, some amazing information technology, some solution that would help us to see, how did we call it now, is it the single view of the customer. So a lot of CRM solutions talk about that. So we now said, okay, we wanted to build this data lake, okay, and so they came to me to say, right, we are starting a data lake project. And I said, okay, where are we getting this information from? And they're saying from the marketing database. I said, okay, now when you were obtaining this information, what did you say to the people? You said, provide your information, fill this form if you want to be added to our newsletter, or you want to be sent our newsletter. And then you now want to use this information, because you have it in the database, to build a data lake, which of course will now you now use to retarget these people who are not aware, you haven't consulted. So there's a lot of organizations do that. So it was a big thing for us. And I had to say, this is a risk. If you must do this, you've got to put it in your privacy policy to say, certain big data projects may require that we might repurpose your information for X, Y, and Z. So we had to do that. So we had to go into our privacy policy. And so the thing is you being upfront and transparent. And so we had to go into our privacy policy, and we included them, because a lot of organizations were getting involved in big data solutions. So massive data lake projects, because of the personalization, just the single view of the customer. Big organizations are doing Facebook and Go. You'd be wondering, maybe you were online and you were browsing on your laptop, then you move to your mobile and you can see what, so that's all that piecing together, and it's all technology, at the back end. So, but what the GDPR is saying, and in fact, if you go onto the ICO website, there's a massive material that talks about big data projects and how to implement them in a lawful way, thinking about the privacy. So they're not saying don't do that because the world is changing today. However, you've got to make sure that you're doing it properly. So that was a massive thing for us then. A lot of pushbacks, but then we had to say, okay, how do we do this in a less intrusive manner? So I think there's a link there you can have. So AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's all around data, using data of people, their behavior, their consumer profiling, all of those things there, and that's where the world is going today. There are ways that you can do that. Data minimization I already mentioned. I'm going to go quickly. Storage limitation. So this just breaks them into some detail. And the accountability principle, whether you're a data controller or a data processor, you've got to take responsibility for how you process personal data of the consumers, and that whose data you have you're custodian of, or you are steward of, because you've got to think data protection, you've got to think privacy, you've got to think security, amongst other principles that have been stated by the GDPR. And of course, lastly is you just got to make sure that as an organization, you think about adequate data protection measures in place, because I normally say to sometimes when I'm getting pushback, and I'm like, put yourself in the shoes of these consumers. If it was you and your data was being processed without in a very intrusive manner, how would you feel, and things like that. So we had to ensure that people we're taking data protection and security very, very, so it's not a case of, it's the company's responsibility. So we had to imbibe that culture within our culture to say everyone is responsible. And if you take it that way, you would, of course, approach things differently. I think this is where we stop for today. Yes, we got in the end a lot to think about, but like I said, you can read up, but I've got plenty of materials, but I don't want to overwhelm you, because I think the last class I did, some people felt overwhelmed because I was just sending them different documents and templates, but I'm going to try and filter a little bit so you don't get overwhelmed. But you will be getting a few bits before the next class. But as a takeaway, go away, as your own homework assignment, go and read more so that you can get a lot more understanding. And then if you've got any questions, now like I said earlier, this course is going to be more practical, and I want to show you and help you to be in a position, to apply these principles and this, everything we're talking about in reality. So it's not just giving you all that theoretical knowledge or information, but how do you apply it? And so we will be working through some templates to say, okay, where do you start from? If you were asked to join an organization tomorrow as a privacy consultant, where do you start from? What do you, what should guide you? How do you measure where the organization is at the time that you joined, so that you can see their maturity posture, and all of those things we will work through with you, so that at the end of the day, you put all these things on your CV, but then it's not just on it, but you know how to do it. And it's something that you can definitely, that's what we aim for. So do some reading. I'm wondering whether we need a separate group. No, I think when you start project work, so you don't have too many groups. But yes, in the course of the week, I would try to drip feed so that you don't have too much, but also go onto the learning management system and go through previous sessions as well. 2 GDPR projects have been done before. Have a look at it so that you get first-hand understanding of how it all comes together. So don't bug yourself with trying to memorize 99 articles because you've just been wasting your time. But just look at the core, the ones that I've mentioned, and do some additional reading. So before the next class, I will send you some materials, and so you know what to prepare for or what we'll be covering. But it looks like we will have 4 sessions and not 3 because of how today started. And I want to say apologies again for how it went. But yeah, so I would like to take any questions now. And I like feedback. I don't know if you've picked that up. I normally would ask to go around the room to tell me one takeaway. If you don't have any questions now, it might be a lot of information, but I would always go around the room to say, give me 1 or 2 things that you are taking away from the class. That's something I like to do just to get us interacting. So I will take any questions for now. We're supposed to 12:30, about 30 minutes late. Yes.
There's a question from me.
Yes, go on.
I just wanted to, while you were talking, I wanted to ask if who goes to, as in, is it the organization that goes to look for the data privacy officer, or the other way around? Like, how does the market work?
Oh, you will find a job. Well,
okay.
So it's just like any job. You will go onto on the website, sorry, online. So there's lots of, maybe tomorrow or the next time you can look at. So when you go onto job boards, are you on LinkedIn?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so on LinkedIn, I know there's, I can't remember who again, Deloitte, they're looking for so many privacy analysts, privacy managers. I think they are doing some mass recruitment, I don't know. So it's out there. So it's not, so they would advertise and you, so once you finish this program, you put your CV together, you start applying, or you could even look inwards, so I know 1 or 2 people who kind of moved roles. So after they had gone through the program and they felt, that, okay, I'm not ready, I want to switch. So you work with you're in the one of the NHS trust. So you could say, oh, I want to join the privacy team. I just finished a course and all of that. And yeah, you could do that. But largely it is the organization that would go out to look for. I think a few months ago, I was looking to fill 2 positions of privacy analysts. So we would say, okay, as part of our privacy program, people come, or we need additional. When we find that, okay, we've got this requirement and then we go and we advertise and we, hire and all of that. So that's how it works.
Thank you.
Hey, any questions? Diwali, all good?
No question, I'm okay. It's straightforward.
Okay, so I know we have gone short over time. So maybe Adiwale, if you tell me what is one thing that you would say you've picked up that you can remember off the top of your head from all the plenty information I've passed on today. What is one thing?
Yeah, it's just for me, it's about the understanding the step to become a data analyst. At least you need to know those 4 steps, I think, and then that will guide you to navigate, in all areas, so that you know what to do, the kind of knowledge you need to acquire, the kind of certification to get that credibility, also all those things. That's my takeaway from it. Okay. At least one of the takeaways I have here.
Okay, Tolu. Thank you.
For me, whilst we were talking, because I have a background in law, but I ran away. it just felt as if I was going back to it. Like I was seeing myself.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that there'll be more of confidentiality
Mm.
while working as privacy officer, and also so many things. It's not all breach of information that you can sue on. There are so many things to pick on.
Okay.
Getting
Okay,
the
that's fine.
consent and all
So
those things. Yeah.
yeah. So the bit about that law and all of that, that's why I kept trying to tone it down and say don't get don't worry too much about all that legalistic jargon and stuff, because you don't need to worry too much and trying to memorize all of them, but you need to know the applicability of them. But then before you can know about how to apply it, you need to know what the principles are. So, and those are core principles. There's not too many of them, but as you go along, you will find that okay, it's sticking, and okay, websites, what should be there, consent box, privacy policy, and all of those things, and things like that. And then that, okay, what does the GDPR? Now, a lot of times when you are even on the job, you are free to research. A lot of things when I started, I didn't know everything. So when they asked me some questions, I will still go back. So I had I share that, which I just didn't want to overwhelm you guys, but I have a link that has the GDPR articles broken down, and I can just check that, okay, Article 30 says, data controllers and processors should have an article of personal activity. Article 5 says this, and when I started, I was quoting articles and it was going over people's heads. They were like, can you break it down? How does that apply to us as an organization? Can you bring it home? So initially it was hard because I was busy worrying myself about this article saying, but then I needed to sit down and break it down to simplify it for an organization to say, okay, this is the reason. So you don't use those words lawful. Well, sometimes you use them because people understand what lawfulness means. But quoting articles, I had a contractor who joined us then, and they didn't renew because he just could not come home. He kept saying article da 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 da, and they were like, nah, this person is not picking up, is not getting a sense of our business. So at the end of the day, it's still really how you can help them to interpret what that article means. And it doesn't require you cramming a subsection, blah, 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 and all those things that you lawyers would do. Helen has a law background as well, and things like that. But as you read more, you see that you get the sense of it. And that's all you want to help an organization to understand. Why should we do this at the end of the day? Why? And mostly a lot of organizations before, they were just like, oh, push back, everything regulatory, anything compliance people don't like. But if you show them that there's also business benefit, we'll talk about that maybe in a later class. Because at the end of the day, they ask you that question. They asked me, I remember that during interviews, that, okay, when you get a lot of pushbacks, how do you get the buy-in of your senior executives? And a lot of it is you want to paint that picture of the benefit that they stand to gain. So for instance, if we say Article 30 says you should have a record of processing activities, and this is why we are carrying out this data mapping exercise that is taking months and years, because people are complaining, why do we have to fill this? Why do we have to do that? And we say that if we do this exercise once, then we now have a record of what we are doing. We also have a record of our information assets. We have our systems. And so that also helps us to say, okay, even if some of those systems have not even been pen tested before, maybe this is security, and I don't want to go too technical. We now know that, okay, for us to protect our infrastructure, we need to put some measures in place, because at the end of the day, if there's a breach tomorrow, it is going to affect you. It's a risk on the business. So you as a privacy consultant, you have to help them see the benefit rather than, oh God, just this whole regulatory stuff that we've got to do. So that's one way of getting the buy-in of your senior executives, and you always need them on the side, because if you have their buy-in, then it can cascade down to others, and a lot of these things is an ongoing thing. It's not overnight. It takes time. It takes awareness. It takes educating them, to see why they need to take things seriously and all of that. So I think it's been a long day already. I'll stop now. But yeah, so don't worry too much about, the legalist stuff. It's just the core principles you need to know about, and how you can break it down, simplify it. And hopefully I'll help you to do that. Right, so I'll let you get on with the rest of your weekend. This will also be uploaded probably during the week onto the learning management system in case you need to catch up with anything. And so go away and do further research. Go and read up about GDPR so that you know things for yourself. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Brenda. Bye. Bye all.
Bye.